Hello, Trinity family. In this time of isolation, we want to continue to reach out and support you. And so in addition to the Facebook message, I'll also be offering a weekly e-note and devotional. And if you're not receiving this, please call the church office and we can get you set up as quickly as possible. And for those of you who are able to continue financially supporting the ministry of our church, please do so. Our ongoing expenses are going to continue even though we're not meeting for worship, and we have a very limited reserve fund that will be depleted very quickly. If you can give using online account that you can access through our website, or you can drop off an offering at the church office. We're going to continue having regular office hours as long as we're permitted to do that. And if you're in need of pastoral care or have a personal need that we might be able to help you with, please call the church office and we'll do our best to help you. We're in this together and we want to be as spiritually supportive as we can possibly be. We love you and we earnestly pray that you'll stay healthy and that this crisis will end very quickly. God is with us through all things, and may God truly bless you. Now this week we continue in our spiritual growth series, and this is part 4 of 5. And the title is, The Spirit Changes Us. The scripture for the morning comes from Mark chapter 10, verse 51. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." And Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." And immediately he regained his sight and followed him on his way. A young woman full of hope and promise and optimism is stricken with a deadly disease. Despite heroic efforts by doctors, and the disease progresses. So how does a parent tell the child they love that it's the beginning of the end? How do you tell someone you love, whom you've been praying along with hundreds of others for healing or for remission, that it doesn't seem to be happening? When I'm confronted with that, I listen and encourage, and then I come to worship. I share with you in the Lord's Prayer. You see, I say the Lord's Prayer in worship because I can't carry all that stuff. I can't control all that stuff by myself. So I say the Lord's Prayer and I hear your voices. And you remind me that I'm not alone, that we're not alone. You remind me that God is here and that we are in all of this together. We are sharing in life together, the good and the bad, the failures and the victories, the struggles and the wonder. Friends, today's step in spiritual growth begins with the words, we humbly ask God to remove our shortcomings. This step acknowledges that we can't do it alone. We have talked over the past weeks of how we get to that place. We get here because we create and we try to sustain false images of ourselves. We get in this place when we try to play God over God, and life gets out of control. We talked last week about letting God in on our struggles, recognizing that the need to share with God and ourselves and another human being the truth of our struggles and our failings and our shortcomings. Giving entrance to God and to another to the things that we don't want to even admit to ourselves. This morning's step is another reminder that we can't do it ourselves, even though we try. This step calls us back to reality. It invites us to begin to walk the road to health and wholeness in a relationship with God that really works. The Apostle Paul has written, to set the mind on the flesh is death, to set the mind on the spirit is to find life. This step reminds us that God is the way of life. God is the way of life. And I wonder if you, like me, have found those times in your life when it has spun out of control and you've experienced the pain of behaviors and attitudes that have poisoned your life and those around you, especially those that you've loved, and you've needed to ask for help, but you bit your tongue. You bit your tongue because above all else you believed that you had to be strong, you had to control all things, and you had to solve everything by yourself. Well, this step declares some very good news, that we have a God who is ready, willing, and able to set us free when we are trapped, to transform our lives in ways that we could only imagine. In Mark chapter 10, Jesus is going to Jericho, and a man is crying out for help, and they bring him to Jesus. And he's a blind man, and as he stands before Jesus, it's obvious that he's blind, and yet Jesus says, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the man said, "Let me regain my sight." And he immediately was healed. And the question for this step is the same for you and me. What do you want the Lord to do for you? Not what do you think you need to do for yourself or what others might do for you. What do you want Jesus to do for you? This step reminds us that we need to quit trying to fix ourselves. After all, if we could, we would have. This step invites us to rely on the power of God, trusting in God's power to bring about the changes that we desperately want and know that we need in our own lives. This step begins with humility, and that's the problem. 21st century America does not value humility. We value self-sufficiency and independence. We value the self-made woman, the self-made man. In fact, humility in 21st century America is thought to mean passive, vulnerable, non-assertive, open to being taken advantage of by others. But in the Bible and in these steps for spiritual growth, humility means something that's quite different. Humility is a path to spiritual growth, and also biblically is seeing ourselves as we really are. Seeing truthfully this marvelous, complex thing we call being a human being, made up of good and bad and strength and weakness. Humility is when we come to deal with the fact that that is all of who we are, all of it. Humility acknowledges that life is a spiritual journey that we have not yet come to the end of. We've not found that utopian perfection that we have tried to create, so we come to church and we share the Lord's Prayer, because as women and men of faith, we know that we don't have to do it alone, that we cannot do it alone. We need one another, and we need God. And of course, we can be strong and helpful to others at times, and this is one of those times, but there will come a time sooner or later in every one of our lives when we need help. And when we acknowledge that truth, we begin to discover that we are imperfect but loved and valued and accepted eternally by God for who we are. See, Christianity is about progress, not about perfection. And hear that again, Christianity is about progress, not perfection. The invitation to spiritual growth begins with us acknowledging that it's possible that we are not perfect, but growth is possible. And so, without pride or pretense, we humbly ask God to identify the real defects and then go about changing them in our lives. And we trust that God will know what needs to be done and when it needs to be done. We trust in a God whose motive is singular to give us a life of love and blessing and wholeness. A life that's not free of pain, but where pain becomes a servant to our growth. This is the God who is just and righteous and stands ready to help us. We begin with humility, but we're on guard for grandiosity. Grandiosity is the word that Keith Miller in his book, Hunger for Healing, that I've used as a source for this series, that he's coined as the problem that confronts all of us. Grandiosity is my inflated self, the picture of myself that I have that's bigger than I am. It is grandiosity that encourages me and tempts me to fire God and promote myself into God's place on the control panel of the world. It is my grandiosity that leads me to practical atheism. And practical atheism is where I trust God with all the big stuff in life, but I go living my everyday life, making all the decisions as if God doesn't care or is uninvolved or is not competent enough to guide me. We say that we trust God with the outcomes of our efforts, and then we feverishly and frantically work hard to make sure that the best outcome happens, which of course is what we determine is the best. And when it doesn't happen, we can't believe that God would let us down like that. That's practical atheism. It is grandiosity that really tempts me to be in control, to be perfect, to be grander than I am, to set up those expectations on myself and others and even on God that no human being can meet or even control. After all, I know what should happen. I know the best outcome in my life, and I invest incredible amounts of energy to make sure that that's what happens. and to keep up the pretense of being the one who is always in control. In this step, we humbly turn our grandiosity over to God. And we respond to the question, are you ready to let God be God? Ready to give up your grandiosity and trust that God's motives are right? Now, this type of authentic spiritual renewal is not going to happen magically. We don't wake up one morning and suddenly we're fixed. It's a journey. I don't wake up one Sunday and I'm all a brand new Mike. It doesn't work that way. Instead, we have to trust God and God's way and God's time. Understanding that changes in our lives will happen in God's time and in God's way. And now if you've been at Trinity for any number of months, you know that this is the point that I have the hardest time with God. I don't disagree with God's will, I just disagree with God's timing sometimes, and the timing that God exercises. So the question again of the morning is, what do you want the Lord to do? Not what you think you ought to have done by yourself. God's way is a slow process that begins to equip us to live differently from the inside out. And it's been said, and I think it's true, that God is more interested in your character than what has happened to you or what you do. And when we allow the creator of and engineer of our lives, we discover authenticity. And authenticity is an enlightenment empowerment within each of us. Authenticity is the harmony between who I am, the good and the bad and the strong and the weak, and who I am becoming. God never wants you to stop being you. The invitation is for you to become the you that you were created to be, that God has planned you to be. I'll give you just a kind of a silly example. Our youngest son loved basketball. He never shot or ball handled particularly well, but he was really fast and he could jump. And when they ran laps, the coaches would refer to him as the rabbit and challenged the rest of the team to not be lapped by him. Well, one of the track coaches saw him running one basketball practice and asked him to go out for track, and Sam at first said no. He said, I'm a basketball player, not a runner. Well, he did ultimately run, and we have a basement full of awards and medals, because the truth is that Sam was always a runner. He just couldn't see it because he thought he was a basketball player. When you and I allow the Creator God to be the engineer of our lives, we discover the serenity of authenticity, of discovering who we truly are. You may be an all-conference, 4-time state qualifying runner and still think you're a basketball player, but you're really a runner. But if you trust God to be the engineer of your life, God is going to replace those excessive worries and anxieties that fatigue and deplete us. God is going to replace that vulnerability with an inner strength of peace and power that is absolutely remarkable to live with. The tragedy of grandiosity is that it builds up layers and layers of pretense so that we end up sitting on expectations that we can't possibly meet. A few years ago, I was called from our conference development director, and he asked me to lead a workshop on campaign ministries, things like the 40 Days of Community and 40 Days of Purpose that I had led with other congregations. And I said yes, and the publicity went out. And then a couple of weeks before the event, I was with a bunch of colleagues, and one of them shared that another pastor, after learning that I was going to lead the session, said he wasn't going to attend because that he'd been totally unimpressed with another presentation that I had done for the conference. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm one of those people who, if I get 99 positive compliments and one negative one, guess which one I live with and stew over for the next 4 or 5 days? And I'm sure so many of you can relate with that reality. So I called the development director back and found out that the formula for that workshop was basically a question and answer, and I'm, as you know, a well-prepared person, and I like to have stuff out in front of me. But he wanted me to just kind of go up there and respond to questions from that large group. So I'm thinking about that one negative comment, and I'm wondering, well, what if I don't have enough to say? What if I really mess up? What if I can't answer all the questions? And then I caught myself, because it was that old grandiosity coming back in the guise of perfectionism. That somehow I'm supposed to have all the answers even before I've heard the questions. So So I passed it on to God and decided that I'm going to trust God with what I was doing for that entire event. Realizing that if they asked me questions I didn't know, I just would say I don't know, and that I could trust God to be with the people in that audience. So what about you? Have you put yourself in charge of all the changes in your life and think that if you could just manage your time a little bit better, then it would all happen? Maybe you've developed a universe that revolves around you and you literally think that if you could just be the best husband or the best wife or the best son or the best daughter or the best father or the best mother, then the world would suddenly be that perfect future that you thought that you could create. What about you? Do you think you need to have just the right answer, just the right amount of money, just the right balance between love and advice, and the world would be perfect for you? And act as if your grandiosity were true, that you don't need anybody, that you have all the answers. Yet you live all the time worried that somebody will discover the real you, will find out that you don't. You see, the tragedy of grandiosity is that the layers of pretending create something that no one can ever live up to. This step comes, and the Spirit of God says, lift up your eyes and see Jesus. Trust his motives. He comes not to demand anything of you, but to simply say to you, what would you like me to do for you? Sisters and brothers, it is nothing less than an invitation to spiritual transformation. And this spiritual transformation is not fear-based. There are Christians and others who want to suggest that our faith is fear-based, but it's not. It is love-based. In the 12-step program, the addict never stops being an addict, just an addict in recovery. Those of us who work like crazy to make up for whatever else it is that we do will always have to deal with that, but we can be in recovery. You see, we are all the same. We're all sinners in need of forgiveness. And like Miller says, that sin disease of grandiosity will always be there. But you and I can learn how to trust God when it surfaces again. Believe that God's motivation for us is the very best, and that trust that God will make the changes that need to be made. And when God does, we can rejoice and know that there will be something else to learn. And we can see that we don't have to be afraid of being human, that being imperfect, needing God, and needing others is what makes us truly human and more human. There's a rule of life out there that says if you are somebody, prove it. Prove it to yourself by having all the answers. Prove it to yourself by never needing anyone. Prove it to God by always being good and doing the right thing. Prove it by being what you cannot possibly be. But the spiritual transformation of our faith is love-based. And when it's love-based, you see the rule of life comes from God. And the rule of life from God is this, that you are somebody. Believe it. You are somebody. Believe it and live it. And when you start to believe that, everything changes. You're ready to celebrate who you are, that wonderfully complex person that God has made you to be. The good and the bad and the strength and the weakness. So you're ready to trust God's motives, God's ability in your life. In the transcript of this message, there's a prayer. And it's there so that you can reflect on it as I share it today. And it's also there so that you can pray it in the privacy of your own home, maybe every day. And if this is your prayer, let it echo from your heart to God. You are loved and accepted, whoever and whatever you are. But if this is not your deal right now, just let it go by you. But if it is yours, whisper these words along with me. My Creator, I am now willing that you should have all of me, the good and the bad, the strength and the weakness. I pray now that you would remove from me every single defective character that stands in the way of my being useful to you and to my brothers and sisters in life. Give me strength. Give me strength to trust in you and with you as I go out from here to do your work in this world. And the people of God said, amen. Again, we miss being with you, and we look forward to that day when we're all back together. But we'll continue in this series as we move towards that great celebration of Easter. May God truly be with you. God's blessings upon you.